Okay, well, I'm just gonna, I've got a few things that I'd like to talk about eventually. I'd like to get around to them, but I'd really like to function as group secretary right now and get a sense of what you would all like to say, question, observe, whatever, about the film. And this can be very free-floating, but I really am very anxious, since I've never taught the film myself, doing it tonight with my students. Some of you are here. But there are a lot of people who are not in my class, and so, and I've actually had very few opportunities to talk to other people about this film. I've read a lot of reviews, but I haven't really talked with a lot of people about this film, so I'd love to hear what you have to say about it.
And I thought the ending was amazing, and just that it feels like the antithesis of a dogma film with this like non-diegetic dance number out of nowhere. It's just incredible.
Okay, and what makes it, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think it is incredible. And what makes it incredible? I mean, that's the question. I mean, what about this last scene? Everybody seems to, who likes this film, points to this scene as being just somehow off the charts. It is incredible in the sense that, I mean, what makes it so, how would you describe it? What do you think of that last scene? Just in general, I'd like to hear what other people have to say about it. I mean, in case you're wondering, did Mads learn his choreography for this? It was sort of improvised, but he was a trained dancer before he became an actor. And so Witterberg said, you know, I want you to dance at the end and do whatever you think, you know, you want to do. But you're absolutely right. The music comes up, and that's a total violation of any kind of dogma rule, as is the, you know, the camera work here, and it still, I think, has a kind of authenticity though, but it's a different kind of authenticity.
I was thinking about the question you left us with at the start about the posters. And what I find so interesting is, I've looked at those posters a lot this week. I work at the Nanovic Institute.
Oh, okay.
And what's striking now to me is that I look at those images completely differently because they're from this final scene, which to me is a completely joyous scene. But when I looked at the posters, sort of knowing a little bit about the movie, but not a lot, I assumed that those images of him were like, you know, he looked exhausted, he looked like he was struggling with some sort of internal turmoil. But then actually when you watch the whole movie, and it's interesting that those different versions of the poster.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in what you're saying, so let me get those images up for you. Keep talking. So just the very last thing that you said. So you're struck by those, how those images are working differently than you thought they were going to.
Yeah, and I'm also struck that I know often the promotion of a movie is quite sort of it's sometimes out of the hands of the director to an extent, or the producers, but. Is that quite unusual that the images that you would choose for a promotional poster are just from one scene in a film? They're from this like final scene. Because to me, there's oh sorry, this one is not from the final scene. This one is.
So yeah, but you know what? See, if there's a shot like that, this very similar in the final scene.
Yes.
And then this shot over here is from the final scene. Where he's kind of running through the champagne that's being sprayed by the students.
But I look at this image completely differently than I would have 2 hours ago. So, because we saw the movie and we know what that scene is like.
And so what you thought was exhaustion is a kind of ecstasy.
Yeah.
And I think that is really interesting in terms of how we're supposed to be feeling about this character at the end. Is there a sense of release? Is there a sense of, I mean, you know, they talk at one point about drinking as emancipation and also embracing life and all of that. I mean, how that gets worked out here in that final dance, I think, is really interesting. And you're right, because when I first saw those images, I thought, I had the same reaction you did, all right, which is this Mads playing yet another self-destructive character that's going to be in pieces at the end. But I think it's really the opposite of that, which I think is really interesting. Other people have it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like that final scene is kind of this really interesting exploration of the question Sebastian is asked in his exam, and that he explains that Kierkegaard argues that a human is made of a body and a soul. And so this last scene being more expressionistic and more non-diegetic than anything we've seen before is kind of suggesting this personal unity of finding one's own identity within the context of like still accepting that physical things are a part of living and being comfortable with that.
Exactly, and then being comfortable with that. And I think you phrased it very nicely. I mean, the sense of acceptance. And to get back to the, the Kierkegaard conversation during the exam period, when they're talking to him about people are not in their head about Kierkegaard. If you want to say something about Kierkegaard, you probably know more than I do about Kierkegaard.
I don't. I'm into this combo. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's okay. I didn't want to count.
I'm a head nodder. Yeah, sorry.
But anyway, the whole this is about being accepting failure, and that somehow the acceptance of fallibility leads to a kind of wisdom, which I think gets worked out in this film in a lot of different ways. I mean, what seems at first anyway, with all of the handheld camera, you think, oh, well, this is going to be kind of a loosey-goosey, steady, shaky cam film, and it's not going to be really all that carefully made in the sense of every line of dialogue is going to somehow echo back later, but it really does. I mean, it's a very, very elegant script in that way. And so I think the way that Hank phrased that, I think is exactly what we need to be thinking about here, which is to go back to things like the card and go back to what finally is liberating. Is it not really the alcohol as much as it's the acceptance of fallibility? Other? Yeah, please.
I think it was interesting, there's this sort of moment of, at the end, it's almost having to lose control to gain control, and I think that dichotomy is interesting because even in saying gaining control, I think, like you said, it's more about accepting that things are out of our control. So I thought that was an interesting, sort of play towards the end there as well.
Yeah, I think, that whole sense of, being in control in this film, I think that's one of the major questions, who's in control? What does it mean to be in control? What does it mean to lose control? And then what does it mean to try to get it back again? And that's something that is indexed in reference to alcohol, but I think it's always made more complicated than that. I mean, this is not a film just about drinking, but in fact about control and losing control. And then in many ways, the alcohol, I think at times becomes almost a metaphor in this film, rather than a social problem film as such. And I want to say that the film is not concerned about that, because the wife says it. So Martin's wife says, "This is a country of alcohol. This is a country of alcoholics." All right, and so the sense of alcohol. This film is very much a Danish film in that sense. That it is a kind of investigation of a whole culture of drinking. But I think we can go too far in that way and miss the kind of larger philosophical questions about control that you're setting up.
Yeah.
Other comments, questions? Yeah, Alexis.
In kind of relation to the wife saying this is kind of a nation, this is a problem within the nation, a scene that really struck me was the funeral when the children were singing and kind of their song was a nationalistic song of Denmark. And I was kind of wondering what this film ultimately says about Denmark and their drinking culture then, and what the audience is left to make of that.
It's a great question. What do you think? It's a question for everybody here. Yeah.
I mean, I think we should also expand that globally with the consideration of alcohol. I was kind of thinking, if I can say this, maybe in parts of the U.S. they would be microdosing instead of drinking with this experiment, So it is saying something about the socially acceptable nature of alcohol.
And you're putting us, I think, in a really interesting direction, which is that if we are going to go back to Alexis's question and think about what does this say about Denmark, but then what does this film also say about other cultures which are, in effect, whether they're alcohol dependent or drug dependent or opioid dependent or whatever. I mean, how much of this is something which is translatable? And this is something that in I'm going to have to bore my students here just for a minute. For those of you that are not in my class, one of the things we've been talking about in this course that I'm teaching and we're doing together called Envisioning Contemporary Europe, we've been talking about films which, in effect, resonate for a national audience. But then how do certain films speak to an international audience? And what kind of film has to, in effect, be engaged in double storytelling? Telling stories that are, in fact, all about what's happening in Denmark, but in fact can also resonate in reference to a country that has an opioid crisis, or a drinking problem like Ireland, for instance, or Italy for that matter, or Germany for that matter. So in effect, this film in many ways is very Danish. Getting back to Alexis's point, all right? The fact that they're singing everything up to, including the national anthem all right, that they're emphasizing the Danishness of all of this. That while there's all this kind of hell raising and drinking and all that, I mean, the soundtrack keeps coming back to basically national anthems. And, you know, it's not a coincidence that in the philosophy exam, they're talking about Kierkegaard. I mean, they're not talking about, you know, Voltaire or Descartes or Lacan or anybody else. They're talking about, so in many ways, this film could hardly be more Danish. All right? Now, that being said, maybe some of you have heard this, Leonardo DiCaprio's film company has bought the American rights to this film. They auctioned the American rights. It was a very, very competitive market. And there is now going to be, if all goes according to plan, an English language version of this film starring Leonardo DiCaprio as Martin. Because he was in search of interesting roles for middle-aged men. Now, I'm telling you that because I think that tells you something about when a certain film is able to engage in that kind of double storytelling, is able to tell a story that resonates within Denmark and really strikes home, but it can also be something which is then that people in different countries with different kinds of substance abuse problems can also say, that's an amazing story. It speaks to my country as well. That reaches a certain kind of threshold. Now you'd think that that would be, you know, enough, all right? But the idea that this film is going to be remade in English involves, I think, all kinds of questions and objections, all right? So my question for all of you is, could this film work as an American film?
I think ultimately the film is about escapism and seeing as the times we're living in. I think that chemical dependency is something that a lot, like I couldn't remember what the exact statistics are, but throughout the pandemic we've seen a huge uptick in those social problems. So it'll be interesting to see how an American audience responds to this and how, you know, that film is made. But I think that the subtext of this film is, like you said, translates, you know, across culture.
Okay, yeah. Please.
Yeah, I wonder too if the problem of banality, right? His problem is described as banal, is like a problem of modernity more broadly. And I think that the fact that he's a teacher trying to do standardized examinations reduces like the passion of teaching to just conveying knowledge. I think it's a story about modernity. Kierkegaard speaks to that, and perhaps it can be replicated in other modern contexts. Teachers pumping out students through their exams and stuff like that. But like, what is the meaning of life if you're just going through those motions every day? It seems to me like an act of resistance to kind of get slightly drunk, and like enjoy your life and your embodiment in a context that's dominating your like daily life. And maybe that dilemma of modernity and banality will speak to a wider audience.
But you know what's interesting about your point is that I think that you're absolutely right about this film. It's, you know, that which creates these burnt out teachers basically is banality, is the fact that it's a standardized test.
Yeah.
And they're all in effect disconnected from the teaching, and it's always framed in terms of you used to be like this.
Yeah.
But somehow the banality throughout the years is soul killing and mind numbing.
This is my wife, and I just, so this, don't read into this comment either, but like banality of like marriage too, right?
Careful.
Don't read into this. This is what we do. We debate these issues together. But like it's like whether it's banality in his personal life then spills over, whether it's going either way. But it's he's in a coma and basically walking through life like he's been reduced to this instrument. So like how do you like have a moment that breaks you out of that puts you in a new zone? Of course, it destroys one man's life, but like makes other lives meaningful. Something to discuss at some point. Yeah.
Good luck with that. But no, I think, you know, to take your really fine point here, all right, about banality, I think it can lead us to asking other questions about the film, all right? Now, to come back around to the fact that Vinterberg wrote the kind of first draft of this screenplay. And then when he was, you know, working with his daughter, who kept saying, you've got to make this into a film, and she was his local source, as it were, for, you know, her generation's drinking culture and all that. And the film starts there and the film ends there, all right? But to say that this film is about, you know, the drinking problem in Denmark or globally, for that matter, and to leave it at that, I think misses the subtlety of this film, all right? Which is that if binge drinking is a problem, how, you know, there is a generational difference. you know, the kind of drinking that the students engage in and the kind of drinking that these middle-aged, burnt-out teachers engage in is a different, I mean, they might be knocking back the same or similar kinds of alcohol, but why they're drinking and then how they turn it into an experiment and what the point of that drinking is in terms of why they do it. I don't get the sense the students are drinking because of the banality of day-to-day life has somehow burned them out to a point where there's, you know, their soul is dead and their mind is numb. It's more a sense of release. It's a sense of we got to take our exams and woohoo, we're done and, you know, let's, you know, go get hammered, all right? That's very different than the kind of drinking that we see the adult men engaging in. And I think if this film does anything, it's to give us a very clear sense that it's not like an indictment that would say the world is full of drunks, but rather that people drink for different reasons. And one might be one reason might be it's the only way to somehow overcome that banality, which in effect, in and of itself can become incredibly self-destructive. But that's very different than the way these students drink. And so then, in fact, I think parts of this script were clearly written by Winterberg about his generation. And then there were other parts of it which were very much informed by his, you know, his daughter Ida's sense of why her generation drinks and how they kind of meet. And that's why I think this classroom scenes are so interesting. Because when he starts talking to them about their drinking and that, you know, what's happening there, I think that's one of the more subtle points in the film. Other comments or questions about the film? Yeah.
Can I ask a polemical question?
Please.
So, because it seems to me that the movie, yes, depicts like a very harsh accusation about the alcoholism and the alcohol culture in Denmark, and as you said, like all over the world. Because we can apply this to many other countries. But at the same time, this is the first time I see the movie, and I study Renaissance epics, so I'm like an outsider. But it seems to me that still the movie depicts a very positive portrait of drinking, because in the end, he got somehow his marriage back, and all his friends except one seems to enjoy a better, I don't know, outcome of the entire story. So, and all the students are drinking and enjoying the party. So it seems to me as a viewer that, oh, then what I have to do in life to overcome my difficulties is actually drinking. Alcohol is the solution, which is still at the same time what the movie is criticizing. So there is a shortcut there, and so I wonder, and as a question, I don't know, what are we as viewers supposed to do? Like, because we all were laughing while watching the movie, but I don't know, I wonder whether that is the actual reaction that we're supposed to do, because I'm thinking about like Renaissance comedy. When we used to laugh in the Renaissance, it was like, oh, I'm laughing at an error, at a mistake, and then so I'm laughing because I don't want to replicate that. But today, we laugh like employing a different mechanism. We laugh because, oh, we're having fun, we are enjoying this, oh, I'm approving this, it's cool, it's great. But I wonder, maybe this is the wrong thing, I don't know, I hope it's clear.
No, I mean, that's a great polemical question. In fact, you just stole the question I was going to ask.
Oh, sorry.
Which is, okay, if this film was just a condemnation of a nation of drinking, which has become a pandemic, then the film could have ended when he looks at his cell phone and his wife says, I miss you too. And because at that point, you know, he's had a glass of wine over dinner or whatever, but, you know, with his friends eating the shrimp. But there's no sense that he wants to get just that much more inebriated. And even when he's dancing, he's also drinking. And so I think that concluding scene, the reason your polemical question is such a great question, is what is the takeaway here? What are we supposed to be thinking about as we, you know, go back to our dorms and apartments and houses tonight, all right? Was this, if this is a condemnation of drinking, it's a pretty problematic condemnation of drinking in terms of where the film leaves us in that last scene. Because if you look at the poster, it says drunk. He's probably at least semi-drunk at this point, and he's being bathed in alcohol, and yet it's the most transformative, epiphanic moment in the film, that he's somehow finally, you know, free. Is he free because of the alcohol? Or is he free because in effect he's admitted his failure? Or just where are we? And I'd like to hear what you have to say about this. Because I think if you use this film as a cautionary tale about the evils of addictive drinking, it's very hard to know what to do with that last scene. So, boy, that was a great polemical question, wasn't it?
Well, I was thinking actually that in terms of what I would take away from this, the relationship between the four friends to me is the heart of the film. It's not even their relationship with their wives or their kids. And I expected at some point there was going to be a punch-up, but there wasn't. I expected someone was going to betray another person within the group, but how solid their friendship was and their agreement to do this experiment together. And yes, you have the older guy, I can't remember any of the names, who unfortunately does fall into alcoholism at the end. But it seemed to me that actually, I didn't find that it was moralizing about drinking, because as you said, people are drinking for different reasons. And it's like as a group, they managed to control that descent into alcoholism. And actually that was the sort of moral heart of the film, rather than a decision not to become alcoholics. It was a decision to be friends who, support each other, understand each other, help each other come through this rough, sort of banal moment in their lives.
I think that's a really interesting way of setting up the entire film, really, because it is a story of friendship. And then if we think of it in terms of these four characters, and that they respond to alcohol differently. I mean, when you think about it, there's that kind of narrative structure where you have 3 or 4 characters all in effect responding to the same thing. I mean, just to use a banal example, Sex and the City did the same thing. You had 4 women who were all trying to figure out, how to find, the right significant other. And they all were in effect defined very differently in terms of their sexuality. In terms of if they were, Samantha was over there and she was, wildly promiscuous. And then you had this kind of spectrum, all right? And I think to consider this film as that kind of a film where the 4 men, in effect, represent different ways of, in effect, trying to embrace life through alcohol, which in effect, in one case, can be incredibly destructive, leading to what we think is probably some kind of alcoholism ending in suicide, as opposed to the final dance that we get here, which is, he's obviously still able to, he's still under control, as it were, getting back to this issue of control, because he's doing some pretty slick choreography here, all right? But he is drinking. So what do we do with that? And I think that's that ambiguity, all right? The fact that this film refuses to finally say, drink is good or drink is bad, all right? And I think it makes this such a complicated film. And it makes me wonder whether a film with Leonardo DiCaprio in an entirely American context is going to be able to maintain that ambiguity. Or if it's going to be a kind of cautionary tale. I'm just thinking, what I worry about is that it's going to become, Wolf of Wall Street too, and it's like, oh wow, look at this crazy excess, woohoo, and then some kind of, at the end, he seems to be somehow contrite. Well, I mean, we'll leave that film aside, but there was the sense that, why was Wolf of Wall Street so popular? Because it did have all of those scenes of total excess, of being just absolutely out of your mind on drugs, but having a really wonderful, entertaining time doing that. And, it was the most successful film that Scorsese's ever made, largely because I think it was the one where, in effect, you were given that ability to come back to, laugh at the absurdity of the situation and to, in effect, enjoy the excess. One of the things I find very interesting about this film, because I've seen it now 3 times in a theater, all right, is that the laughter is kind of a nervous laughter, all right? You're really not sure if you're supposed to be laughing at this, and then you're like, yeah, this is pretty funny. This is ridiculous. I'm going to laugh at this. And then as you begin to realize that things are starting to kind of go sideways for these characters, even though there's a lot of things that might still be funny, there's very few laughs. And so how the comedic aspects of this are, deployed very strategically throughout the film, in such a way that you're encouraged to laugh out loud and then encouraged to wonder whether you should be laughing or not, I think is another sign of how really intricate this film is.
So to that point, I can't remember the name of the podcast, but there's a podcast of two recovering addicts that I've listened to before, and they tell stories of when they were using, and they're all laughing and having a great time when they share these stories, but ultimately they kind of realize like, we were being knuckleheads and putting ourselves in grave danger by, engaging in this behavior. And so I think that like some of the laughter, at least for myself, is like, it's almost a knowing laughter. It's almost oh yeah, I've been that sort of like stupid before in my life. So it's definitely interesting to think about where each character is in their life when the experiment begins, because I think that even, in speaking about Tommy, when he goes and asks about, his ex-wife and stuff, you can kind of see that he's already in a place that maybe he's more primed than some of these other characters may be.
Very definitely.
Yeah.
So, but I want, you make two really important points. The first one about that sense of we've been there, we know that, and there's that sense of empathy.
Mhm.
And I think the script is very carefully constructed for us to empathize with these characters, for us to feel sorry for these characters as burnouts. First few times they get drunk, we're like, yeah, I've been there too, and yeah, this is kind of fun. It's better than what you had before, right? Because that scene where he's just reading from the book is one of the saddest depictions of teaching I've ever seen in the history of cinema. I mean, that's pretty grim. But then, where are we then as that arc plays out? I think that's really interesting. Yeah.
I just wanted to say I found the last image fascinating because it's also quite ambiguous. I mean, he's throwing himself into the sea.
Yeah.
So, the dance is liberating, but there's also an edge to it. It's not completely, and then just to freeze on that moment of him flying into where? Off the cliff, it's...
Yeah, I think that's a really insightful point, because we see him sitting on the bench looking out at the water. And I'm thinking, when I'm watching that, he's thinking about Tommy, committing suicide in that same lagoon or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And he is sort of, where is he flying to? I mean, is he flying into the water? I mean, I don't think he's ending his own life. On the other hand, we've just had the sea established as a place of death. And for him to sit there and look very, very, profoundly saddened when he's sitting on the bench, looks out and sees the water, and then jumps up and starts to dance. And so is it a sense of, no, I'm not going to take that route, and I'm going to, embrace life no matter what it is, no matter how badly I failed, I'm not dead, so I'm going to keep dancing. But you're right. I mean, the fact that it sort of freezes him as though he's up going into the water. And I think that open-endedness of that final shot and just where he's going to land also is a very good way of thinking about, well, where does this film land? Because in effect it refuses to show us, definitively, you must land this film here, because that's what you're supposed to take home. I think they're supposed to, what you're describing, I think is, for me, the final takeaway. Not just in terms of the last shot of the film, but how it summarizes in so many ways the open-endedness of many of the questions. I mean, the film doesn't pull any punches, but I think it refuses to be schematic at the end. Other comments, questions? I just want to make sure everybody's had a chance to talk. Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming.
Thank you.